He was just a quiet black janitor mopping the marble floors of a five-star hotel, until a proud, soon-to-be bride laughed at him in front of her guests, mocking his dirty job. But what she didn't know, that Janitor actually owned the entire hotel chain. And before her wedding day was over, she would lose not only her venue, but her reputation too. Before we find out what happens next, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person, hit that like button. The Grand Regency Hotel glittered. It was a palace of modern design, a place where money whispered from every polished surface. In the main ballroom, crystal chandeliers dripped light onto tables dressed in white linen and silver. The air smelled of expensive perfume and freshly cut flowers. This was the kingdom of Tiffany Monroe, at least for tonight. Her rehearsal dinner was a performance, and she was the star. Her laughter, sharp and loud, cut through the gentle murmur of her guests. She stood at the head of a long table, a glass of champagne in her hand. Her white dress a beacon of purity that her personality did not quite match. Her fiancé, Ethan, stood beside her, a handsome but quiet shadow, his smile looking more like a polite habit than a genuine expression of joy. The guests, a collection of wealthy friends and family, watched her with a mixture of admiration and fear. Tiffany was the kind of person you agreed with simply to avoid an argument. She thrived on attention, and tonight, she was soaking it in. The evening was flowing as smoothly as the vintage champagne being poured. Waiters moved like ghosts between the tables, silent and efficient. One of them, a young woman named Sarah Gomez, was balancing a tray of full wine glasses. She was new and her hands trembled slightly under the weight of the delicate crystal. She navigated the narrow space between two tables, her focus absolute. But then, a guest shifted his chair back without looking. The leg of the chair caught Sarah's ankle. She stumbled, the tray tilted. For a horrible slow-motion second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, gravity won. The glasses tumbled, a cascade of crystal and red wine crashing onto the marble floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the otherwise perfect room. A collective gasp went through the guests. The wine splashed outwards, a dark red stain blooming on the pristine white floor, stopping just inches from the hem of Tiffany's expensive dress. Silence fell. Every eye in the room was on the spill, then on Sarah, whose face had gone completely pale. She stood frozen, her hands still held out as if she could somehow reverse what had just happened. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words barely audible. "I'm so sorry." Tiffany stared at the puddle of wine, her perfectly sculpted lips curling into a sneer. She didn't look at Sarah. She looked at the mess as if it were a personal insult. From the edge of the ballroom, a figure emerged. He was a man in his early 40s, dressed in simple gray janitor's overalls. He moved with a quiet purpose, holding a mop and bucket. This was Malcolm Price. His presence was unassuming, his steps measured and calm. He approached the spill without a word, his focus entirely on the task at hand. He intended to clean the mess quickly, to erase the disruption and let the evening continue. He knelt down, ready to absorb the wine with the head of his mop. But Tiffany wasn't finished. She looked from the wine to Malcolm, and a cruel spark lit her eyes. "Ugh, keep that filthy thing away from me," she snapped, her voice slicing through the quiet room. She waved a manicured hand at him, her diamond engagement ring flashing under the chandelier light. It was a gesture of dismissal, as if he were an insect she wanted shooed away. The guests shifted uncomfortably. This was more than just annoyance. This was public humiliation. Malcolm paused, his mop hovering just above the floor. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said a word, yet she was treating him like a piece of garbage. He spoke in a low, soft voice, a voice that carried no anger, only politeness. "My apologies, ma'am. I just need to clean this up." His calm demeanor seemed to infuriate her even more. She wanted a reaction. She wanted him to shrink, to cower. His dignity was an offense to her. She let out a short, sharp laugh. Figures, she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. They'll hire anyone these days. A few of the guests, the ones most loyal to Tiffany, chuckled along with her. It was an ugly sound, a nervous, follow-the-leader kind of laughter. Most, however, just stared at their plates, their faces tight with embarrassment. Ethan, her fiancé, placed a gentle hand on her arm. "Tiffany, that's enough," he murmured, his voice low. She shook him off, her smirk unwavering. Sarah, the waitress, watched the scene unfold, her heart pounding in her chest. She felt a hot wave of shame, not just for herself, but for how Malcolm was being treated. He was only there to clean up her mistake. She wanted to say something, to defend him. But the words were stuck in her throat. She was just a waitress. What could she do? She was afraid of losing her job, of making the scene even worse. So she remained silent, a silent witness to the casual cruelty. Malcolm didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply held Tiffany's gaze for a long moment. There was no anger in his eyes, no shame. There was just a quiet, profound stillness. It was as if he was seeing right through her, past the expensive dress and the loud voice, and seeing the small, insecure person underneath. Then he broke the eye contact. He lowered his mop to the floor and began to clean the spilled wine. His movements were efficient and precise. He worked in silence, ignoring the dozens of eyes that were still fixed on him. When the last of the red wine was gone, from the white marble he stood up. He didn't look at Tiffany again. He simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the room at large. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps making no sound on the freshly cleaned floor. The camera of the hotel's security system, hidden in the ceiling, lingered on his back as he disappeared through the service door, his quiet dignity a stark contrast to the ugliness that had just filled the room. Back in the staff corridor, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. The glittering facade of the ballroom was gone, replaced by the harsh fluorescent lights and the sterile smell of cleaning supplies. The whispers started almost immediately. "Did you hear what she said to him?" One waiter asked another, his voice low. "Called his mop filthy, right to his face." Another employee, a cook on his break, leaned against the wall and shook his head. "Rich people," he muttered. "They think they own the world." Some of the staff chuckled nervously. They had all seen things like this before. It was part of the job, swallowing your pride while serving people who had none. "Just keep your head down," an older waitress advised a younger one. "Don't get involved. It's not worth your job." This was the unwritten rule of the service industry. The customer is always right, even when they are horribly, cruelly wrong. Sarah Gomez, however, couldn't just let it go. Her hands were still shaking from dropping the tray, but now it was from anger, not nerves. The image of Malcolm's calm face as Tiffany mocked him was burned into her mind. She felt a deep sense of guilt for her own silence. She had stood by and watched it happen. She saw Malcolm by the staff lockers, quietly putting his mop and bucket away. He moved with a sense of peace that seemed impossible after the scene in the ballroom. Sarah took a deep breath and walked over to him. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little shaky. I just wanted to apologize for what happened out there. It was my fault. I'm so sorry for how she treated you." Malcolm turned to face her. Up close, she could see the lines of kindness around his eyes. He didn't look like a man who had just been humiliated. He looked like a man who understood the world in a way she didn't. He offered her a faint, reassuring smile. "It wasn't your fault," he said, his voice as calm as it had been in the ballroom. "Accidents happen. As for the rest of it..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Respect says more about a person than their title ever will." Sarah was taken aback. She had expected him to be angry, or at least upset. But his words were filled with a strange wisdom. He spoke with an eloquence that didn't seem to fit his janitor's uniform. She found herself looking at him more closely. His hands, though calloused from work, were clean and well kept. His posture was perfect. There was something about him that didn't add up. He seemed more than he appeared to be, as if sensing her thoughts. Malcolm's smile widened slightly. "Don't you worry about it, Sarah," he said, and she was surprised that he knew her name. "You have a good heart. That's what matters." Before she could reply, he glanced down at his wrist. For the first time, she noticed the watch he was wearing. It was partially hidden by the sleeve of his overalls, but she could see enough of it to know it wasn't a cheap department store watch. It was sleek and dark, with a face that seemed to absorb the light. The brand was unfamiliar to her, but the craftsmanship was obvious. It was a custom piece, something that looked like it belonged on the wrist of a CEO, not a janitor. It was probably worth more than she made in a year. Malcolm saw her looking at the watch and quickly pulled his sleeve down. He then pulled a small, sleek tablet from a pocket inside his overalls. It was another object that seemed out of place. He tapped the screen a few times, his fingers moving with practiced ease. On the screen, Sarah caught a glimpse of a line of text before he angled it away. It read, "Behavioral Audit, Monroe Wedding. Observation complete." He looked up from the tablet, his expression once again unreadable. "Have a good night, Sarah," he said, his tone polite but final. He gave her a nod and walked down the corridor, disappearing around a corner. Sarah stood there for a long moment, completely bewildered. A behavioral audit? What did that mean? And who was this man? The eloquence, the expensive watch, the mysterious tablet. It all painted a picture of someone far more important than a simple janitor. A strange feeling settled in her stomach, a mix of confusion and intrigue. She had the distinct impression that Tiffany Monroe had just made a very, very big mistake. The quiet man she had mocked was not who he seemed to be, and Sarah had a feeling that the real story of the night was just beginning. Earlier that same morning, the sun had risen over a sprawling modern mansion nestled in the hills overlooking the city. Inside, in a walk-in closet the size of a small apartment, Malcolm Price stood before a full-length mirror. Racks of expensive tailored suits lined the walls, each one a testament to his success. He was the billionaire owner of the Grand Regency Hotel chain, a self-made man who had built an empire from the ground up. But he wasn't looking at the suits. Instead, he reached for a simple set of gray janitor's overalls hanging on a hook by itself. His personal assistant, a sharp young man named David, stood in the doorway, a look of confusion on his face. "Mr. Price, are you sure about this?" David asked, his voice laced with concern. "The board meeting is at noon, and you have the quarterly review with the finance team this afternoon." Malcolm pulled the overalls on over his clothes. They were clean but worn, a symbol of honest work. "David," he said, his voice calm and steady, "you can't manage people if you don't understand how they're treated. You can't see the real heart of a company from a penthouse office." This was a ritual for Malcolm. Every few months he would choose one of his hotels and work undercover for a day as a low-level employee, a janitor, a bellhop, a dishwasher. It was his way of staying connected to the reality of his business. His entire empire was built on a single, powerful principle, a lesson taught to him by his late mother, Mrs. Price. She had worked as a hotel maid for 30 years, scrubbing floors and changing sheets in hotels just like the ones he now owned. She had taught him that every person, regardless of their job title, deserves to be treated with dignity. She had shown him that humility was not a weakness, but a strength. Respect first wasn't just a corporate slogan he had put on the company website. It was the foundation of his entire life's work. It was a promise he had made to his mother's memory. His assistant sighed, knowing better than to argue. "All right, sir. I'll have security monitor you from a distance. Chief Nolan is on standby." Malcolm nodded. "Just make sure they stay out of sight. I need to see things as they really are, not as they appear when the boss is watching." He picked up a worn baseball cap and pulled it low over his eyes. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The billionaire was gone. In his place was a janitor, just another face in the crowd, invisible to the very guests whose comfort he was responsible for. This was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to see if his company's core value, respect first, was actually being lived by his staff, and just as importantly, by his guests. The Grand Regency wasn't just a place to sleep. It was supposed to be a place where everyone felt valued. What had happened with Tiffany Monroe in the ballroom was more than just a moment of rudeness. It was a direct violation of everything his brand and his mother's legacy stood for. Now, hours after the confrontation, Malcolm was no longer in the staff corridor. He was in the hotel's central security office, a high-tech room filled with monitors displaying feeds from every corner of the building. He stood before the main screen, his arms crossed, watching a replay of the scene from the ballroom. He saw the wine spill. He saw Sarah's panicked face. He saw himself walk into the frame with the mop and bucket. Then he watched as Tiffany Monroe, in crystal-clear high definition, waved her hand in disgust. He heard her sharp, cruel words. "Ugh, keep that filthy thing away from me." He heard her mocking laugh. "Figures. They'll hire anyone these days." He saw the uncomfortable expressions on the faces of the guests. He saw his own calm, steady reaction. He watched the entire scene play out without a single flicker of emotion on his face. He was no longer the janitor. He was the owner, the judge, the man who held the power to correct this injustice. He watched it once, then twice, his expression hardening with each viewing. The disrespect was not just an insult to him as a man. It was a cancer in his establishment, and it needed to be cut out. He turned to the security chief, Nolan, who was standing silently beside him. "Save that footage," Malcolm said, his voice quiet but firm. "All angles." "Yes, sir," Nolan replied. Malcolm's face was unreadable, a mask of calm control. But inside, a cold resolve was setting. He had seen enough. The behavioral audit was indeed complete. He turned away from the screens and looked out the window at the city lights twinkling below. Softly, almost to himself, he said, "Tomorrow morning, we fix this." Sarah couldn't sleep that night. The events of the evening replayed in her mind like a movie on a loop. Tiffany's sneering face, the sound of her mocking laughter, the uncomfortable silence of the guests, and most vividly, Malcolm's quiet dignity in the face of it all. She tossed and turned, the guilt eating away at her. She had done nothing. She had stood there, frozen by fear, and let that woman humiliate a good man. His words echoed in her thoughts. Respect says more about a person than their title ever will. He was right, and her silence, she felt, had said something ugly about her. She was ashamed. By the time the sun began to stream through her apartment window, she had made a decision. She couldn't stay silent. It wasn't right. She sat down at her small kitchen table and pulled out a piece of paper and a pen. She decided to write an anonymous note to the hotel management. She didn't want to cause trouble for herself, but she couldn't let Tiffany's behavior go unchecked. Her hand trembled as she wrote, describing the incident in detail. She wrote about Tiffany's cruel words, the laughter of the guests, and the calm professionalism of the janitor who had been targeted. She folded the note, put it in an envelope, and slipped it into her work bag. She would drop it in the anonymous employee feedback box in the staff lounge. It wasn't much, but it was something. When she arrived at the hotel for her morning shift, the atmosphere was different. There was a buzz in the air, a sense of anticipation. Staff members were whispering in corners, their eyes wide with excitement. Sarah tried to ignore it and made her way to the staff lounge, her hand clutching the envelope in her pocket. She was about to slip it into the feedback box when she saw something that made her stop dead in her tracks. Walking down the main corridor, surrounded by the hotel's top executives, was Malcolm. But he wasn't wearing his janitor's overalls. He was dressed in a perfectly tailored dark blue suit that probably cost more than her car. He walked with an air of authority that was unmistakable. The general manager, Mr. Langston, a man known for his stern and intimidating demeanor, was walking beside him, listening intently and nodding respectfully. Other managers followed a few steps behind, their expressions a mixture of reverence and nervousness. They were all treating him like a king. Sarah froze, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The man she knew as a quiet janitor was clearly the most important person in the room. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. As the group passed by the staff lounge, Malcolm's eyes met hers. He didn't look surprised to see her. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod in her direction, then said something quietly to Mr. Langston. The group continued down the hall, but Malcolm paused. He turned and walked towards her, a calm smile on his face. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. She stood there, speechless, the anonymous note still clutched in her hand. "Good morning, Sarah," Malcolm said, his voice the same gentle tone she remembered from the night before. He glanced at the envelope in her hand. "I imagine I know what that is," he said kindly. "But you don't need it." He looked her directly in the eyes. "I'll take it from here." Sarah's mouth opened, but no words came out. It was all too much to comprehend. She finally found her voice, a stammering whisper. You're the owner?" The question hung in the air between them. Malcolm's smile was gentle without a hint of arrogance. "Sometimes," he replied calmly. "Sometimes. I'm just the janitor." He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder for a brief moment. "Thank you for being willing to do the right thing, Sarah. That kind of integrity is rare." He then turned and rejoined the group of executives, leaving Sarah standing alone in the hallway, her world completely turned upside down. She looked down at the note in her hand, the words she had so carefully written, now seeming small and unnecessary. The quiet janitor didn't need her to defend him. He was the owner. And Sarah had a feeling that Tiffany Monroe's perfect wedding day was about to fall apart in the most spectacular way imaginable. Tiffany Monroe arrived at the hotel later that morning, gliding through the lobby like a queen returning to her castle. The events of the previous night were already a distant memory for her, a minor annoyance that had been quickly forgotten. She was here to finalize the last-minute details for her wedding, which was now less than 24 hours away. Her bridesmaids trailed behind her, a chorus of fawning admiration. "That ballroom is going to look absolutely stunning, Tiff," one of them gushed. Tiffany waved a dismissive hand, a smug smile on her face. "Of course it will. I designed the entire color scheme myself." She was in her element, basking in the glow of her own perceived importance. As they walked towards the hotel's event planning office, she started bragging. "You should have been there last night," she said to a bridesmaid who had missed the rehearsal dinner. "This clumsy waitress spilled wine everywhere, and then this filthy janitor tried to clean it up right next to my dress. I had to put him in his place." She laughed, a sound that was both sharp and self-satisfied. "You should have seen his face. He didn't know what to say." Her fiancé, Ethan, who had been trailing silently behind the group, finally spoke up. A worried frown creased his brow. "Tiffany, maybe you should let that go," he said, his voice low and cautious. "You really shouldn't talk to people like that. It's not a good look." Tiffany stopped and whirled around to face him, her eyes flashing with anger. "A good look? Ethan, don't be ridiculous. He's a janitor. He's lucky to have a job. Someone needs to teach these people their place." Her words were laced with an entitlement so profound it was almost breathtaking. She truly believed that her wealth and social status gave her the right to treat others as less than human. She saw the world as a hierarchy, with her at the very top and people like Malcolm at the very bottom. Ethan sighed and shook his head, clearly choosing to drop the subject. He knew there was no reasoning with Tiffany when she was like this. Arguing with her was like arguing with a brick wall. He fell silent again, his discomfort visible on his face. What Tiffany and her entourage failed to notice were the glances being exchanged by the hotel staff. The bellhops by the door, the concierge at the front desk, the waitstaff preparing for the lunch service. They all watched her with a quiet, knowing resentment. The story of what had happened at the rehearsal dinner had spread through the hotel like wildfire. Everyone knew how she had treated Malcolm. They had all, at one time or another, faced a guest like Tiffany, arrogant, demanding, and cruel. But this time was different. This time, the person she had insulted wasn't just one of them. He was the man who signed their paychecks. The staff said nothing, of course. They maintained their professional smiles, their polite nods, but their silence was heavy with a shared secret. They knew something that Tiffany didn't. They knew that a storm was coming. The camera of the hotel's security system lingered on Tiffany's smug face, then panned to the silent, watching staff. It was the calm before the reckoning, the quiet tension that builds just before the lightning strikes. Tiffany Monroe, lost in her own arrogance, had absolutely no idea that her perfect world was about to be brought crashing down around her. High above the city, in his penthouse office at the top of the Grand Regency, Malcolm Price sat behind a large mahogany desk. The office was a masterpiece of minimalist design, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the skyline. But Malcolm wasn't looking at the view. He was looking at a single file on his computer screen, the file for the Monroe-Clark wedding. It contained every detail of the event, from the 5-course menu to the 6-figure floral arrangement budget. He read through it one last time, his expression completely neutral. Then he picked up his phone. He didn't need to look up the number. He pressed a single button on his speed dial. The call was answered on the first ring. "Mr. Langston," Malcolm said, his voice calm and even, devoid of any emotion. "Yes, Mr. Price," the hotel manager replied, his voice on the other end of the line filled with a nervous energy. "I have one instruction for you," Malcolm continued, his tone leaving no room for discussion. "Cancel the Monroe wedding." There was a moment of shocked silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Langston finally stammered, "Sir, the wedding is tomorrow. All arrangements have been made. It's a very high-profile event." "I am aware of the timing, Mr. Langston," Malcolm said, his voice turning colder, sharper. "The decision is final. I want all of our staff and vendors to cease preparations immediately. Issue the client a full refund, effective immediately. Wire the money back to their account within the hour. I do not want one single dollar of that woman's money in my company's possession." But sir, the contract—" Langston began to protest, his voice trembling slightly. "The contract has a clause regarding conduct on hotel property," Malcolm cut him off. "Ms. Monroe's behavior last night was a clear violation of that clause. She created a hostile and disrespectful environment for my staff. We are well within our rights." His words were like chips of ice. There was no anger, just a finality that was more intimidating than any shouting could ever be. "Is that understood?" "Yes, sir," Langston squeaked. "Perfectly." "Good," Malcolm said. He was about to hang up, but then he added one more instruction. "And Mr. Langston, when she arrives, you will be the one to inform her." He wanted the message delivered personally by the highest-ranking manager on site. After he ended the call with Langston, he immediately made another one. This time, it was to the chairman of his board of directors. "John," he said, his voice returning to its normal, calm tone. "I need you to call a full meeting with all stakeholders tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp." "Is everything all right, Malcolm?" the chairman asked, sensing the urgency in his voice. "Everything is being put right," Malcolm replied. "There's something we need to address as a company. It's about our core values." He ended the call and stood up from his desk. He walked over to the massive window, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked out at the city he had, in many ways, conquered. From this height, the people below were like tiny ants, going about their busy lives. He had once been one of them, a man no one noticed. Last night, he had been that man again. The man who was mocked for mopping floors now stood in a tower of power, preparing to sweep a deep-seated injustice clean from his own empire. The reckoning was about to begin. Tiffany stormed into the grand ballroom, her face a mask of fury. She had been on her way to a final dress fitting when she received a frantic call from her wedding planner. Something was wrong at the hotel. When she arrived, she found not the scene of bustling preparation she expected, but one of bizarre and infuriating chaos. The catering team, which should have been setting up for the next day's feast, was packing up their equipment. The floral team was dismantling the elaborate centerpieces they had spent hours creating. The beautiful custom-made ice sculpture of two swans was being wheeled away on a dolly, already starting to melt under the warm lights. The ballroom, which should have been a hive of activity, was being stripped bare. "What is going on here?" she shrieked, her voice echoing in the cavernous space. "Where is everyone? My wedding is tomorrow." The workers ignored her, continuing their tasks with a grim determination. They had been given their orders. She spotted her wedding planner in a corner, looking pale and distressed, speaking frantically into her phone. Tiffany marched over to her. "Tell me what is happening right now," she demanded. The planner looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "I don't know, Tiffany. I can't get a straight answer. The hotel manager, Mr. Langston, won't take my calls. They just keep saying, 'The event has been canceled.'" The words hit Tiffany like a physical blow. "Canceled? What do you mean, canceled? You can't cancel my wedding. I've paid for everything." She pulled out her own phone and frantically dialed the hotel manager's number. It went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Voicemail. She was starting to panic, her rage mixing with a growing sense of dread. This was her perfect day, her perfect venue, and it was slipping through her fingers. She marched out of the ballroom and down the hall to the management office, her bridesmaids trailing behind her like frightened birds. She slammed the door open without knocking and found Mr. Langston standing behind his desk, looking as if he were facing a firing squad. "You!" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You have 5 seconds to tell me why you are ruining my wedding." Mr. Langston swallowed hard. He was a man used to being in charge, but the cold finality of Malcolm Price's voice was still ringing in his ears. He straightened his tie, trying to maintain a shred of professional composure. "Ms. Monroe," he began, his voice strained, "I'm afraid there's been a change of plans. Your event has been—" "Don't you dare say it's been canceled," she shrieked. "Who? Who did this?" Mr. Langston took a deep breath. "Ms. Monroe, your event has been canceled by direct order of the owner." Tiffany's face, already flushed with anger, drained of all color. The owner? She had never met the owner. She didn't even know his name. In her mind, the owner was some faceless old man who lived on a yacht and counted his money. Why would he care about her wedding? "The owner?" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Why? I have a contract. This is a 5-star hotel, not some roadside motel. You can't just do this. Call him. Get him on the phone. Now!" She slammed her diamond-clad hand down on the polished surface of the manager's desk. The sharp crack echoed in the silent office. The staff members in the adjoining room, who had been listening to the entire exchange, exchanged knowing glances. They had seen Tiffany's arrogance firsthand. Now they were witnessing the consequences. The air in the room was electric with tension. Tiffany's world, a world built on the belief that her money could buy her anything she wanted, was beginning to crumble. And she had no idea that the man responsible for it all was the very same man she had tried to humiliate just one night before. An hour later, Tiffany and Ethan were sitting in a small, opulent waiting room just outside the main hotel boardroom. A junior executive had approached them with a carefully worded offer. The owner was willing to meet with them personally to resolve the misunderstanding. The offer was a small lifeline, and Tiffany had grabbed it. She had spent the last hour convincing herself that this was all just a terrible mistake, a mix-up that could be smoothed over with the right combination of threats and charm. Her anger had subsided, replaced by a cold, arrogant confidence. She was Tiffany Monroe. People didn't say no to her. She turned to Ethan, who was sitting beside her, looking pale and worried. "This is ridiculous," she said, smoothing down her designer dress. "I'm sure once this owner realizes who my father is, this will all be over." He probably just wants more money. I'll have Daddy write him a check." Ethan just shook his head, a deep sense of unease settling in his stomach. "Tiff, I don't think that's what this is about," he said quietly. "You were really out of line last night. Maybe you should just, apologize." Tiffany scoffed. "Apologize? To a janitor? Ethan, you're being naive. In this world, you don't get ahead by apologizing. You get ahead by showing people you're in charge." The door to the boardroom opened, and the same junior executive beckoned them inside. "Mr. Price will see you now," he said, his face impassive. Tiffany stood up, squared her shoulders, and walked into the room with the confidence of a conquering general. Ethan followed reluctantly behind her. The boardroom was long and elegant, with a single massive table made of dark, polished wood. The room was silent and intimidating. Seated around the table were several men and women in dark suits, their faces grim. They looked like a jury. At the head of the table, in a large leather chair, sat a man with his back to them. He was staring out the window at the city skyline. "Mr. Price?" Tiffany said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I'm Tiffany Monroe. I believe there's been a terrible misunderstanding about my wedding." The man in the chair didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable. Tiffany's smile began to falter. She exchanged a nervous glance with Ethan. Finally, the chair slowly swiveled around. The man who turned to face them was not the old, faceless billionaire she had imagined. It was the janitor. He was wearing the same dark blue, impeccably tailored suit Sarah had seen him in earlier. His expression was calm, his eyes steady, but there was a hardness in them she hadn't seen before. The air rushed out of Tiffany's lungs. Her jaw dropped. A wave of disbelief followed by a cold, sickening horror washed over her. She felt her legs go weak. She reached out and grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself. Her mind simply could not connect the two images, the quiet man with the mop and the powerful man sitting at the head of this table. It was impossible. Beside her, Ethan whispered, his voice filled with dawning comprehension and dread. "Oh my God, that's the janitor." Tiffany turned pale, a ghostly white that stood in stark contrast to her vibrant red lipstick. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in her life, Tiffany Monroe was utterly, completely speechless. The power dynamic in the room had shifted completely. The woman who thought she was in charge was now face to face with the man she had treated like dirt. And he was the one who held all the cards. Malcolm remained seated, his hands resting calmly on the polished surface of the boardroom table. He watched Tiffany's confident facade crumble into dust, his expression unchanged. The shock in the room was a tangible thing, a heavy silence broken only by Tiffany's ragged breathing. He let the silence hang in the air for a long moment, allowing the full weight of the situation to settle upon her. He wanted her to understand completely and totally the magnitude of her mistake. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it filled the room with an undeniable authority. "Good morning, Ms. Monroe, Mr. Clark," he said, his tone perfectly level. "Please have a seat." Neither of them moved. They were frozen in place, staring at him as if he were a ghost. Malcolm didn't press the issue. He simply continued, his gaze fixed on Tiffany. "You see, Ms. Monroe, there has been no misunderstanding." He paused, letting the words sink in. "When you mocked one of my employees last night, you mocked me." A collective gasp rippled across the table from the board members, who were now watching the scene with rapt attention. Tiffany finally found her voice, a weak, stammering protest. I didn't know," she whispered, the words sounding pathetic even to her own ears. "I had no idea who you were." Malcolm held up a hand, silencing her. "It shouldn't matter who I was," he said, his voice cutting through her excuses. "It shouldn't matter if I was the owner of this hotel or the man cleaning its floors. Every person who works in this building, from the general manager to the dishwasher, is a part of my team. They are the heart of this company, and they all deserve to be treated with a basic level of human decency and respect. He pressed a button on the small console in front of him. A large screen on the wall behind him flickered to life. The boardroom was suddenly filled with the sights and sounds of the previous night's rehearsal dinner. It was the security footage. They all watched in stark, high-definition silence as the scene played out. They saw the wine spill. They saw Sarah's terrified face. And then they saw Tiffany, her face twisted in a sneer, waving her hand in disgust. Her voice, amplified by the room's sound system, was sharp and cruel. Ugh, keep that filthy thing away from me. The camera zoomed in slightly, capturing the uneasy looks on the faces of her guests. Then came the final damning line. Figures, they'll hire anyone these days, followed by her own mocking laughter. Ethan looked devastated. He sank into a nearby chair and put his head in his hands, unable to watch anymore. The woman on the screen was a monster, and he was supposed to marry her. Tiffany stood there, forced to watch her own cruelty, her face burning with a shame so intense it felt like a physical fire. The laughter of her guests, which had seemed so validating at the time, now sounded ugly and hollow. When the footage ended, the screen went black, plunging the room back into a heavy silence. Malcolm's eyes were fixed on Tiffany. "My mother was a hotel maid for 30 years, he said, his voice now softer, but filled with a deep personal weight. She worked harder than anyone I have ever known. She taught me that the value of a person is not measured by the size of their bank account or their job title, but by the kindness and respect they show to others. Respect first is not just a slogan we put on our brochures, Miss Monroe. It is the foundation of this entire company. It is the promise I made to her, and your behavior last night, your casual public humiliation of a man you thought was beneath you, violated the very soul of what we stand for." The silence that followed was deafening. There were no more excuses to be made. The truth, in all its ugly detail, had been laid bare for everyone to see. Tiffany's perfect world had not just been cancelled. It had been exposed as a hollow, rotten sham. Tiffany's composure, the arrogant shell she had worn her entire life, finally shattered. The color rushed back to her face in a blotchy red tide of humiliation. Tears welled up in her eyes, not tears of remorse, but tears of pure, unadulterated panic. Her perfect wedding, her social standing, her entire identity. It was all collapsing around her. "Please," she begged, her voice a desperate, cracking whisper. "Please, you can't do this. It was a mistake. I was stressed. The wedding, it was just a joke." She looked around the room at the stony faces of the board members, searching for any sign of sympathy. She found none. They looked at her with a cold, unified disapproval. This was the woman who had threatened the reputation of their brand, a brand built on the very principle she had so carelessly trampled. Malcolm listened to her pleas, his expression unmoved. When she finished, he slowly rose from his chair. He was a tall man, and his presence seemed to fill the room. He looked down at her, not with anger, but with a deep, profound disappointment. "Dignity is never a joke, Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice low and final. The words hung in the air, a sentence delivered by a judge. "The Grand Regency Hotel is more than just a building. It's a promise to our guests and to our staff, a promise of safety, comfort, and respect. You have shown that you do not share our values. Therefore, you are no longer welcome here." He turned to Mr. Langston. "The cancellation of Ms. Monroe's contract is permanent," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "Furthermore, her name and the names of her immediate family will be blacklisted from all Grand Regency properties worldwide. We will not do business with people who treat our staff with such contempt." The finality of his words was like a series of hammer blows. This wasn't just about a canceled wedding anymore. This was about a permanent exile from the world she so desperately wanted to dominate. At that moment, something inside Ethan finally broke. He had been silent for too long, a passive observer in Tiffany's cruel world. He slowly stood up from his chair, his face a mixture of shame and resolve. He didn't look at Malcolm. He looked at Tiffany, the woman he thought he loved, and saw a stranger. "We're done," he whispered, the words barely audible, but carrying the weight of a final decision. I can't do this anymore. I can't be with someone like you." He didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked out of the boardroom without a single look back, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing like a gunshot. Tiffany stared at the empty doorway, her mind reeling. First her wedding, now her fiancé. Her entire future had just evaporated in the span of 5 minutes. She let out a choked sob, a raw, ugly sound of complete and utter defeat. The camera of the hotel's internal recording system, which had been documenting the meeting, stayed on her face. Pale, tear-streaked, and utterly shattered. Around her, the board members watched in stony silence. There was no pity in their eyes, only a cold, hard judgment. Her humiliation was total. The petty tyrant who had laughed at a janitor was now alone, stripped of her power, her wedding and her future, in a silent room full of people who had witnessed her fall. Later that day, the tense, formal atmosphere of the boardroom was replaced by the warm, comfortable familiarity of the staff lounge. The smell of coffee hung in the air. Malcolm Price, now dressed in a simple but elegant sweater and slacks, sat at one of the tables. Across from him sat Sarah Gomez. She was on her break, a half-eaten sandwich in front of her, but she wasn't eating. She was too stunned, too overwhelmed by the events of the day. She had heard the whispers, of course. Everyone had. The story of Tiffany Monroe's canceled wedding and the dramatic boardroom confrontation had spread throughout the hotel. To know that she had played a small part in it all was both terrifying and exhilarating. Malcolm took a sip of his coffee and smiled at her, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "I wanted to thank you properly, Sarah," he said, his voice gentle. "I know you were going to submit that note. You were willing to risk your job to stand up for what was right, to defend someone you thought was a powerless janitor. That takes a special kind of courage." Sarah blushed, looking down at her hands. I couldn't stand by and let that happen," she said quietly. "It wasn't right." "No, it wasn't," Malcolm agreed. "But many people see things that aren't right and choose to look the other way. They stay silent because it's easier, it's safer. You didn't. You chose to act." He leaned forward slightly, his expression serious now. "In my experience, that's the true definition of leadership. It's not about giving orders or having a fancy title. It's about having a strong moral compass and the courage to follow it, even when it's difficult." He paused, then continued. "I've been reviewing your employee file. You're a hard worker, you're smart, and your colleagues respect you. But more importantly, you have integrity. And that's a quality I value above all others in my company." He took a deep breath. "Which is why I'd like to offer you a promotion. The position of Assistant Operations Manager just opened up. It's a big step with a lot more responsibility. But I believe you're ready for it. I believe you're exactly the kind of leader this hotel needs." Sarah's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Assistant Operations Manager? That was a major corporate position. It was a career, not just a job. She had been working 2 jobs just to make rent, and he was offering her a future she had never even dared to dream of. "Me?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "But I'm just a waitress. I don't have the experience." "You have the one qualification that can't be taught," Malcolm replied calmly. "You saw what mattered most. You saw a person's dignity being attacked, and you knew it was wrong. You can learn the logistics of hotel operations, Sarah, but you can't learn character. You already have that." Tears began to well up in Sarah's eyes, but this time they were tears of joy and gratitude. A smile, bright and beautiful, broke through her stunned expression. She realized he was right. She had simply tried to do the right thing, And in doing so, she had been handed a future she never thought possible. A new life, born from a single act of courage. In the days and weeks that followed, a sense of calm and renewed purpose settled over the Grand Regency Hotel. The drama of the Monroe wedding faded into a cautionary tale whispered among the staff. Malcolm Price no longer walked the halls, in disguise, but he hadn't retreated back to his penthouse office either. He made a point of being present, of walking through the kitchens, the laundry rooms, and the lobby, greeting every employee by name. He would stop and talk to the bellhops, ask the housekeepers about their families, and thank the dishwashers for their hard work. The staff, in turn, no longer saw him as just the intimidating billionaire owner. They saw him as the man who understood their value, the man who had stood up for one of their own. A new sense of pride and loyalty blossomed within the hotel walls. They worked harder, smiled more genuinely. They felt seen. Sarah Gomez thrived in her new role. She proved to be a natural leader, empathetic and efficient. Her first major project was to develop and implement a new company-wide training program. She called it Respect First. It was a program inspired by the events of that fateful night, designed to reinforce the company's core values at every level. It taught staff how to handle difficult guests with grace, but it also empowered them, making it clear that they would be supported by management if they were ever treated with disrespect. The moral of the story was clear, woven into the very fabric of the hotel's culture. Status, wealth, and power meant nothing without kindness and decency. The true measure of a person was how they treated those they believed they had power over. One quiet evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Malcolm stood alone in the main lobby. The glittering chandeliers were dimmed, casting a soft, warm glow on the polished marble floors. He walked over to a quiet corner of the lobby, where a small, elegant display was mounted on the wall. It was a tribute to the company's history. On one side was a framed copy of his first business license, the official document that marked the beginning of his empire. On the other side, in a matching frame, was a simple, worn maid's uniform. It had belonged to his mother. He looked at the uniform, the symbol of her 30 years of tireless, often invisible, labor. He thought of her strength, her resilience, and the simple, powerful lessons she had taught him about the dignity of work and the importance of respect. He reached out and gently touched the glass of the frame, a silent thank you to the woman who had shaped him. "You taught me right, Mom," he murmured, his voice soft in the quiet lobby. His empire was not just built of glass and steel. It was built on the foundation of her memory, a testament to the enduring power of respect. If this story about dignity and justice moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories like this one. What would you have done in this situation? Let us know below.